Hello and welcome, I'm Alas Gerjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Today we're talking about the deadliest conflict in human history and the 80th anniversary of its outbreak, the Second World War. Estimates of civilian and military deaths go as high as 85 million. A long time has passed since that day, yet the massive consequences of that global conflict for so many people make it feel as if it only has just come to an end. To discuss this, we're joined in the studio today by Serhiy Ryabenko, expert of the Institute of National Remembrance. Hello and thank you for joining us. So for commemoration of this 80th anniversary of this global tragedy, the Second World War, Poland held large-scale memorial events, and for that it invited top officials from nearly 40 countries, including Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, but Russia's President Vladimir Putin, we know that he was not invited this year. Could you please explain our audience why?
I think that Poland did not invite the Russian President Vladimir Putin because the Russian Federation says that they nowadays are the state that makes the aggressive deeds against Ukraine, against very many other countries of the world. So it was maybe the political decision of the top politics of the president, the government of Poland, do not invite the state who nowadays is also the state who makes the aggressive war against their neighbors.
Yeah, conducts the same kind of behavior.
Yes. The second reason maybe is that the beginning of the Second World War started with the aggression of the Nazi Germany against Poland. But if we study the documents, we see that there were two countries that were responsible for the beginning of the Second World War. One of them was the Nazi Germany, the other was the Soviet Union, who signed the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, who opened the doors of the Second World War. From nowadays, the Germany understand the responsibility for the starting of the Second World War. And nowadays we also see the German President Walter Steinmeier in Poland.
Exactly.
During these activities, and this year and the previous years he says that the German is responsible for the beginning of this conflict. Yes, they know their responsibility, and they do not say that they are not the country who is responsible for this.
And they deliver the apology every year.
Yes, they make their apologies for the crimes that were committed by the Nazi Germany during the Second World War. On the other hand, we see the Russian Federation, who is this state that is who's
the successor of the Soviet Union? Yes, the
successor of the Soviet Union. But from Moscow we hear the other words, that they are not responsible for the beginning of the Second World War, that all these years at the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union made all their activities to prevent the war. They did not sign any agreement with the Nazi Germany, and they are not responsible for the beginning of the Second World War. This is maybe the second part of the answer why Vladimir Putin, as the president of the Russian Federation, was not invited to Poland.
Right, because as you mentioned, Moscow clearly expects a global gratitude to Russia's or Soviet Union's efforts to end this war. But what about their part in inflaming the Second World War, as you mentioned before? Well, this topic is very interesting, and very interesting behavior of the German president and the Russian president and his office. I would like to let the audience know about the reaction from Russia. Well, we know that Vladimir Putin was not invited to these kind of events since March, when there was planning on this grand event of commemorating the 80th anniversary. And then in the Council of Russian Federation, this step was called a manifestation of a complete political ingratitude. This is the same thing that I was talking about, that this global gratitude should be addressed to Russia. And the first deputy chairman of the Committee on International Affairs of the Council of the Federations, Vadim Zhibakov, advised Warsaw not to forget things to whom the war ended. And then we have the reaction from the Russian president's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. I have a quote: "Any memorial events in any country in the world which are dedicated to the anniversary of the Great Patriotic War," this is the second issue that we're going to discuss with you, "and World War II, without the participation of our country," meaning Russia, "cannot be considered complete." Well, I cannot ask how adequate is this reaction, but I would ask you maybe about your opinion how to deal with these kind of comments when clearly we are living in two different realities. I mean, the citizens of Russian Federation, they do not even have a clue about the real history. And I have to confess that I am 27 years old and I am 1 year younger than independent Ukraine, but I was studying about the Great Patriotic War, not about the Second World War. So how can we tackle this issue, and how can we make the realities somehow dissolve into one?
The myth of the Great Patriotic War is maybe one of the greatest myths that was created by the Soviet propaganda after the Second World War. This myth was created to hide the real role of the Soviet Union in the beginning of the Second World War. Till now, the Russian officials, the Russian legislation, they say that Russia or the Soviet Union, they did not take even part in the Second World War. The war that took place on the territory of Soviet Union, to their opinion, was Great Patriotic War that started in June 1941 and ended in May 1945. But what about the period that was previous to the date of 22nd of June 1941? The Russian and the Soviet propaganda, they say that Russia and Soviet Union did not take part in the Second World War. They try to hide this real role because if they start to speak about the activity of the Soviet Union, of the Communist Party and the chief leaders of the Soviet state, this information would not be very good for for nowadays Russian political elites, for the head of the Russian Federation, because at that period of time, as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, they committed the crimes of aggression against their neighbors. So nowadays, very many of the inhabitants of Russia, they still believe that the war that took place for the Soviet Union was not the Second World War, but the Great Patriotic War. Mm-hmm. For nowadays, if we are speaking about Ukraine, till the year of 2015, in our legislation system, we also had such a term as Great Patriotic War, and all the dates connected with this period were the dates of the Great Patriotic War.
Yeah, but then in 2015 it changed.
Yes, only in the year 2015, when the Ukrainian parliament adopted the so-called package of the decommunization law, we nowadays have the right terminology in our legislation system, and nowadays we are speaking about the Second World War, not about the Great Patriotic War in the terminology of the Russian and Soviet propaganda.
But do people realize the difference? Do people understand what is the Great Patriotic War about and what is the Second World War about? Has any kind of survey been done for studying that matter?
I think that not maybe all the people still understand the difference, because very many people who lived the most part of their life in the Soviet Union, they still believe in the Soviet propaganda of Great Patriotic War, only because they could not believe that there were two countries that were responsible for the beginning of the Second World War, that these two countries were the aggressors against their neighbors, and it's much easier for them to believe believes that war started for the Soviet people in June 1941, when the Nazi Germany started the invasion on the territory of Soviet Union. Not from the September of 1939, when the Soviet army made their own invasion to the territory of Poland, and after that to the territory of Finland and other neighbor states. Nowadays, people have much more information about the beginning, about the reasons why the Second World War took place, about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that opened the doors for this war. But I think that this work of opening this the story of these pages of the history of 20th century should be continued.
Well, I also hope that Ukrainians will be more aware of what happened 80 years ago, because as far as I see right now, just yesterday we had this grand sporting event at the National Stadium on Olympijski, where people were jogging and doing some kind of record-breaking sport things, but actually on the morning day we usually try to be calm and try to remain somewhere aside from the entertainment. Speaking of the modern day, what kind of myths maybe would you outline that were created, more myths that you would outline that were created by Russian or then Soviet propaganda that still remain around Ukrainians?
There are several such myths. One of the greatest myths is the myth of Great Patriotic War, but the other ones are the myths connected with the period of the Second World War that took place on the territory of Ukraine. For example, one of the main popular myths connected with the role of Ukrainians in the Second World War that Russian modern propaganda likes very much is the myth that the Ukrainian nation has more collaborators with Nazi Germany during the Second World War than any other nations that lived on the territory of Soviet Union.
Well, but basically Ukraine was the battlefield of the Second World War. The whole country was the largest scale of all these chaos happening on our territory.
Yes, but still only 17% of the Russian Federation were under the Nazi occupation during the Second World War, and if we calculate the number of the Russian people who make collaboration with Nazi Germany and who were involved in the military organizations of the Nazi Germany, there are more of them that took place in make their activity in the ranks of these organizations than the Ukrainian people do during Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
Another very popular myth of the modern Russian propaganda is that during Second World War, all Ukrainian national organizations that made their fighting for the freedom of Ukraine, they all were the Nazi collaborators organization.
Which is not true. Well, and also, since you referred to this division onto Ukrainians who were pro-Nazis, Ukrainians who were pro-Soviets, we should all remember that there were ethnic Ukrainians that were participating in the Polish army that was fighting the German aggression at the very beginning of the Second World War. And there were tens of thousands or even more of Ukrainians who were participating in the Red Army because the country was occupied by the Soviet Union. And of course, there was a part of Ukrainians who were collaborating with Nazis. We have to admit that, and we are admitting just that, but we cannot play these facts in the way that just shows Ukraine as the main collaborator of Nazi Germany. Unfortunately, the topic is very broad, but unfortunately we are running out of time, so I have the very last question. Has Ukraine learned its lesson about keeping its true history protected from rewriters?
I hope so, and I hope that the package of decommunization laws that were adopted in the year 2015 by the Ukrainian parliament, it makes the possibility for our citizens, for the people to know the true history by opening the former KGB archives, for example, for the people who wants to know this true history.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for delivering these important comments, and thank you for being a guest today in our studio. That was Serhiy Ryabenko, expert of the Institute of National Remembrance. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more with UATV.